So today's episode will focus both on mechanisms and tools, that is the use and leverage of caffeine to improve mental health, physical health, and performance. And most people think that they consume caffeine because it makes them feel more alert. But there are many reasons why you're consuming caffeine. Caffeine is one of the most widely used substances on the planet. Estimates are that more than 90% of adults and as many as 50% of kids, that is adolescents and teenagers, use caffeine on a daily basis. And I'm not going to tell you that consuming caffeine is necessarily bad. In fact, today I'm going to tell you about many of the positive health benefits of caffeine, including neuroprotective effects, antidepressive effects, and certainly performance-enhancing effects, both for mental performance and for physical performance. Now, caffeine is an amazing molecule. Most people are not aware of is that caffeine acts as a strong reinforcer. Caffeine is present in many foods, even unbeknownst to us. When it's present in drinks and foods, we actively come to like those foods and drinks more than if caffeine were not contained in those foods and drinks. That is, caffeine is not just a stimulant, caffeine is a reinforcer, and it's a reinforcer that plays an active role in almost everybody's daily life. So it reinforces our liking of particular foods and drinks, and indeed, it even reinforces our liking of the containers they are consumed from and the company we keep when we consume foods and drinks that contain caffeine. Reinforcer. In fact, caffeine is such a strong reinforcer that if even tiny amounts of caffeine are present in certain foods and drinks, you will very quickly come to prefer those foods and drinks over other choices, which can be. I want to tell you about some recent results about a molecule that's found in certain caffeinated beverages and that has been proven to be very useful for both weight loss, mental performance, and controlling blood sugar levels. And that's GLP-1, or glucagon-like peptide 1. Glucagon-like peptide 1 is found in the brain and body. One of its primary effects, it's been discovered, is to reduce hunger, and it does that two ways. It does that by activating certain neurons in your hypothalamus. GLP-1 acts on certain receptors in the gut to make us feel as if we've ingested enough food. And GLP-1, as I mentioned, works on the brain to create these feelings of satiety, as if we've had enough, and to reduce our desire to eat more. Now, why am I telling you all this? Well, today we're going to talk about caffeine, and there's one particular caffeine source, which is yerba mate. And there's some other forms of teas similar to yerba mate. Yerba mate teas are known to stimulate significant amounts of GLP-1 release, and so they can be effective as a weight loss tool, mainly by blunting appetite. And again, they do that both at the level of the brain and at the level of the gut. Yerba mate tea, provided it's not the smoked variety, and I mention that because a number of people have cued me to the fact that yerba mate teas come in smoked varieties and non-smoked varieties, and the smoked varieties are thought to perhaps be carcinogenic, that is, pro-cancer causing. So I advise people to avoid smoked varieties of yerba mate tea. Yes, it makes you feel more full at the level of brain and body, but it turns out it also stimulates thermogenesis. Now, thermogenesis is the active utilization of more metabolic energy, and fat cells, in particular so-called beige and brown fat cells, are a potent source of thermogenic activity in your body. Well, when you ingest yerba mate tea, or you were to take a GLP-1 analog or stimulate GLP-1 in any number of different ways, yes, you stimulate increased satiety, but you're also stimulating the conversion of these white fat cells into beige and brown fat cells, which makes you more thermogenic, and over time raises your basal metabolic rate. So you're burning more calories even at rest. It also makes you feel as if you're more comfortable in colder environments at rest. Caffeine is known to have certain neuroprotective effects, and that is because of its ability to increase neuromodulators such as dopamine, but also other so-called catecholamines like norepinephrine. If you don't know what those names mean, these are molecules that increase levels of alertness, motivation, and drive. And so then, therefore, not surprisingly, the large-scale analyses of the relationship between depression and caffeine shows that provided people are not drinking so much caffeine that it makes them overly anxious, that regular intake of caffeine is inversely related to levels of depression. So it may have some antidepressant effects, and those could be direct or indirect. What do I mean by that? Well, you can imagine that if people are ingesting caffeine and they are more motivated to do work and pursue quality social interactions, then the probability that they will have depression could be lower. It could also be that there are direct effects on the chemical systems of the brain that relate to mood and well-being that could offset depression. It is not clear whether or not the effects of caffeine in countering depression are direct or indirect. Nonetheless, there's a relationship there, and it's an interesting and positive one. Caffeine can improve mental performance and physical performance. Perhaps the most robust finding across all of the studies that I've examined is that caffeine reduces our reaction time. That is, it improves our reaction time. It doesn't make it longer, it makes it shorter. So for instance, in a laboratory study where people were asked to hit a lever every time they hear a tone, you can greatly reduce the time between the tone and the pressing of the lever if people ingest caffeine about 30 minutes before they do that task. Now that seems like a trivial task, but this is also seen in the domain of sports performance and even in cognitive performance, where people have to arrive at a particular answer to a question, and the answer to that question has to be pulled from their memory banks within their brain, their hippocampus, for instance, a brain structure involved in memory. And if you are asking people, for instance, to remember the capitals of different states or cities, or to remember certain historical facts, they will do that at a particular rate. But if they've ingested caffeine within the hour prior, their ability to recall that information is much, much better. They are faster, and it does not appear that accuracy is reduced. In fact, in many cases, accuracy is enhanced. And that's because caffeine both works on the reaction time systems of the brain and body. I'll talk about the mechanisms for that in a little bit, but it also stimulates certain neurotransmitters and so-called neuromodulators within the brain and body that give the neural circuits in the brain that are associated with learning and memory a lower threshold to activation. What does that mean? That means that we are better able to access the brain circuitry involved in learning and memory when we have a certain amount of caffeine circulating in our system. So this makes caffeine an incredible performance-enhancing compound. There are also many ways in which caffeine stimulates the release of chemicals in our body that act as reinforcers, but those reinforcers are subconscious. That is, we are not aware that they cause this preference for the activities that cause their release. Well, in nature, caffeine is present in very low concentrations or is masked by other flavors within flowers, beans, and plants. Plants and nectars that contain very small amounts of caffeine are the preferred sources of food for bees. And the study is beautiful because they were able to confirm that they could mask the caffeine taste. So they know that the bees are not preferring the taste of caffeine. But what they do is they pair caffeine with different food sources for the bees. Then they remove the caffeine. And what they find is that the bees very strongly prefer flavors that contain caffeine, not because they could taste the caffeine, but rather for the way that those caffeine-containing flavors made the bees feel. So how do those caffeine-containing flavors make the bees feel? The same way that they make you and I feel, a little bit more alert, and thereby able to do more work. For the bee, the more work is the consumption of more food, which then has a further reinforcing effect. So what we're really talking about here is the fact that A, caffeine exists in nature, in plants. It exists in concentrations that are very low, so low, in fact, that they are not detectable to the taste receptors of insects, and in many cases to the taste receptors of humans. And of course, there can be high levels of caffeine in a plant, but if the plant also contains compounds that mask the flavor of caffeine, well then those plants are going to essentially be even stronger reinforcers for the flavor of the plant. Okay, so now we're talking about strong flavors plus strong neurostimulant effects of caffeine. And the most important point here is that all of these effects of caffeine are subconscious. It is not because the bee or you likes the taste of caffeine. In fact, most people, when they take their first sip of coffee, they find that it tastes bitter and kind of noxious. They don't like it. You may not even remember that because it happened so long ago, and because caffeine is such a strong reinforcer that very quickly you come to like the taste of coffee. You might even come to like the feeling of your mug in your hand. You might even come to like the smell of coffee and so on and so forth. And that's because caffeine stimulates the release of certain neurochemicals in the brain, in particular dopamine and acetylcholine, two neuromodulators that increase our focus and alertness and our feelings of well-being.